Hello again, everyone. So for this video, we're going to look at the election of 1972 and the Watergate scandal that ultimately brings down President Richard Nixon. So to start off, we'll look at kind of the election of 1972 itself. Um, Basically, by 1972, by the time of the election of 1972, um, Richard Nixon was in a fairly strong place politically. He had done a number of things that gave him very high approval ratings at this point. His approval ratings in 1972 stood at around 60%, which is hard for many people to believe considering how kind of infamous his name is as a figure in American politics today. But he did enjoy fairly high approval ratings in 1972, and there's a number of reasons for that. He had achieved significant breakthroughs in the Cold War by pursuing a strategy of détente with the Soviet Union and China. His process of Vietnamization and along with it the strategy that inaugurated in 1972 of intensive bombing to bring about, a peace settlement uh, proved to be very effective in reducing American casualties, but also bringing momentum to the peace negotiations regarding the Vietnam War. The fact that Vietnamization had significantly reduced the number of Americans serving in Vietnam to basically a small handful of people by this autumn of 1972 meant that Nixon likewise had largely, um, neutralized one of the major, kind of issues that had, encouraged the anti-war movement. So, his strategy of Vietnamization, controversial as it was in some quarters, proved to be very effective in reducing American casualties and in the process also, largely, reducing the effect of the anti-war movement. Like I said in previous videos, anti-war demonstrations decreased significantly after 1970 as the number of American troops coming in Vietnam begins to decline precipitously. So he had those things going for him. He had, like I said, he had um, these major foreign policy breakthroughs with the Soviet Union and China. The American war in Vietnam was drawing to its conclusion, and on top of that, he had success in environmental regulation. And then there's also the fact that Nixon was very good at activating cultural antagonisms. His pursuit of the Southern strategy of peeling off disaffected working class white voters in the South and in the North had proven very effective by playing into these sort of cultural um, battlefields, these sort of cultural divisions that had emerged during the late 60s. So, for all of those various reasons, Nixon was in a very strong place politically. On top of that was the fact that his Democratic opposition at this time was badly divided. The Democratic Party was still reeling from the 1968 Chicago convention fracas, and there was considerable division between the older, more socially conservative, pro union wing of the party and the newer, younger wing of the party that was increasingly controlled by activists and feminists and civil rights activists. So there's this strong division within the Democratic Party. Um, in spite of all these things, in spite of all these inherent strengths, Nixon is so paranoid, so fearful of any potential challenge to his authority that he goes to extraordinary lengths in the 1972 election to try to ensure his victory. Actions that in the end would bring about the downfall of his presidency. Um, One of the things that Nixon had displayed throughout his political career, and which would ultimately become the principal source of his own downfall, was a tendency, a desire, a need to completely dominate and obliterate and destroy, crush his adversaries. Nixon didn't want to just beat his opponents, he wanted to completely crush them. And this had manifested itself in this very kind of what has since become known as the paranoid style of politics, this siege mentality in the Nixon White House that reflected a deep seated hostility to the press, towards his Democratic opponents, towards the anti war movement, and a variety of others. And Nixon responded to all of these things in very aggressive fashion, and oftentimes with great secrecy, and increasingly through less than legal means. Um, this really begins to cascade in a downward fashion for Nixon starting in 1971 with the release of the Pentagon Papers. The release of the Pentagon Papers, even though they did not at all concern the Nixon administration, really, really upset and set off Richard Nixon. And, he took it as a personal affront that state secrets had been released, and that the press had chosen to air those secrets, air that dirty laundry. And so, after the release of the Pentagon Papers, Nixon develops a deep seated hostility towards the press, and towards the anti war movement, and other perceived enemies and adversaries that becomes a major component of his mentality. One of the first things that he does after the release of the Pentagon Papers is he forms a new special White House investigation unit. And the purpose of this White House Special Investigation Unit is laid bare by the name that they call themselves. This White House Special Investigation Unit called itself the White House Plumbers because their purpose was to, quote, stop leaks. And so, following the release of the Pentagon Papers, um, the pattern of illegalities that would eventually bring Nixon's presidency to a crashing halt, or to its destruction, begins when the White House plumbers stage a break-in at Daniel Ellsberg's, the man who had released the Pentagon Papers, the defense contractor who had released the Pentagon Papers. They break into a psychiatrist's office to try to find incriminating information about him that might discredit him in the eyes of the American people. And so this marks the beginning of this sort of pattern of illegalities within the Nixon administration. With the election coming ahead, many of the people involved in the White House plumbers become involved in a new organization, Nixon's covert reelection campaign, which is known as the Committee to Reelect the President, or as it is appropriately known in shorthand, CREEP. Um, and what CREEP begins doing is utilizing money that the Nixon administration had received from what are basically amounted to kickbacks from corporations seeking to curry favor with the Nixon administration, or to receive beneficial contracts, like the International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, ITT. Um, Nixon had been able to establish this large slush fund that financed a wide array of dirty tricks operations, and illegal operations undertaken by CREEP. And CREEP became very heavily involved in the 1972 Democratic primary. In the 1972 Democratic primary, the divisions within the Democratic Party, which had emerged in 1968, were still nowhere near reconciled. And so it was a pretty bitter battle between more establishment figures like Hubert Humphrey, and as well as more reactionary figures like George Wallace, who tapped into a lot of the same racialized resentments as Nixon had. But also, you had more kind of middle of the road candidates like Edmund Muskie, and then you had anti-war firebrand George McGovern, who attracted support primarily from activist groups and from the anti-war movement. And so it's a pretty intense primary. Eventually, after it becomes pretty much a two-man race between Muskie and McGovern. And recognizing that Muskie was the stronger candidate of the two, Nixon's operatives try to sabotage McGovern. They forged this letter, the so-called Canuck letter, as it comes to be known, in which Muskie allegedly speaks disparagingly of French Canadians. And then there were rumors spread about his wife having a drinking problem and all kinds of other stuff. And eventually, Muskie delivers a speech in which he appears to start crying, and that kind of torpedoes his presidency. Um, and so after Muskie is effectively, kind of pushed out of the race because of the innuendo and the rumors largely spread by Nixon's creep operatives, the Democratic nominee in 1972 becomes South Dakota Senator George McGovern. Now, McGovern is one of those people who's become somewhat of a legendary, almost boogeyman figure in American politics, about the dangers of ideological extremism in a mainstream candidate. The reality is a little bit more complex. McGovern was actually a decorated war hero. He had flown 35 missions over Nazi Germany during World War II as a B 24 bombardier. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was a history professor, and he was a well known orator at the time. But during the 1960s, in spite of the fact that he had voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, McGovern becomes a fierce critic of the Johnson administration and eventually the Nixon administration's handling of the war in Vietnam. And so by 1972, that had become his principal focus, the war in Vietnam. Um, McGovern's platform principally focused on anti-war stuff, which in and of itself was problematic because politically, because by that point, the war in Vietnam was, from most Americans' perspectives anyway, largely something in the past. The number of Americans serving in country was minimal at that point. Um, the peace negotiations seemed to be moving forward and seemed to be reaching a point of conclusion. So McGovern runs as a peace candidate at a time when the anti-war movement had really lost a lot of momentum, and public attentions really had begun to focus elsewhere. Um, but the things he became controversial for were things that were included in the Democratic platform that year, including amnesty for draft evaders, as well as support for various liberal causes like the gay liberation movement, and a variety of other things. And so Nixon's operatives, again, are able to paint McGovern as this out of touch, aloof liberal. The fact that McGovern had failed to win any broad support with the Democratic Party's working class labor constituency. He's the only Democratic president in after 1932 to not receive a major major labor union endorsement from the AFL-CIO. Um, Likewise, hurt him. Um, so the Nixon administration portrays him as this aloof, out of touch elitist. They refer to him as the candidate of, quote, acid amnesty and abortion. Again, generally distorting his positions on a wide range of issues. But McGovern's own campaigning doesn't help things. He was a famously inept campaigner. He delivered his uh, acceptance speech for the Democratic nomination at 3 in the morning when most of the country literally slept through it. And eventually he had to drop his first VP pick, Missouri Senator Thomas Eagleton, when it became when it was revealed that he'd undergone electric shock therapy. So it's a poorly ran campaign. It's running on an issue that by that point had really lost its sense of urgency for many Americans, and who really just wasn't culturally in step with where much of the country was at the time period. and the results are pretty predictable. As a result of all these things, um, Nixon ends up winning one of the largest landslides in American political history in 1972. He carries 49 of 50 states. The only places that McGovern actually carries are ultra liberal Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. So it's an absolute, um, you know, bloodbath politically, and one where Nixon ends up quite triumphant. Now, his political coattails don't sweep very far. The Democratic Party maintains control of both houses of Congress, actually picks up seats in the House in the 1972 election. That'll end up becoming very important when we look at the events that occurred during the subsequent Watergate investigation. Now, in the midst of the 1972 campaign, in June of 1972, um, a break-in occurs at the Watergate Hotel complex in downtown Washington, D.C., which is where the Democratic National Committee headquarters were located. Um, During that break-in, five operatives who were members of the committee to re-elect the president are arrested. And initially, the arrests of the five burglars, as they came to be known, attracted comparatively little media attention. The Nixon administration very quickly denounced the burglaries and tried to distance itself from them, saying, quote, this was a third-rate burglary attempt, and we do not condone that sort of second-rate activity. Um, and for the most part, after the break-in and the subsequent denial by the Nixon administration, much of the public, for a time, forgot the Watergate break-in. It kind of disappeared from the front page of the news, but ultimately did not impact Nixon's victory in the 1972 election. But ultimately, in the months after Nixon won re-election, the Watergate break-in and the developments in the case that proceeded from it would eventually resurface and would eventually completely consume the presidency of Richard Nixon, eventually bringing out one of the biggest political cover-ups and scandals in American history, culminating in Nixon's resignation in August of 1974. And that is where we're going to pick up with in the next video.